The axe fell, a sharp crack in the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. Ilara's breath plumed white in the chill morning air, her dark skin gleaming with a fine sheen of sweat despite the cold. Each swing was a testament, a prayer, a curse. The log, stubborn and unyielding, finally surrendered with a groan, splitting clean. She didn't pause, didn't allow herself the small victory. There were more logs. Always more logs. Her hands, raw beneath worn leather gloves, ached with a deep, familiar pain. This was her penance, her claim, her fragile rampart against a world that had offered her nothing but scorn and a fleeting, brutal utility. The wind, a constant companion, whipped at the thin fabric of her dress, a garment mended so many times it was more patched than original cloth. It carried the scent of pine and distant snow, and sometimes, she thought, the faint, unsettling aroma of wood smoke that wasn't her own. She worked from dawn until the light bled from the sky, a solitary figure against the immense canvas of the Dakota Territory. The skeleton of her cabin rose slowly, painfully, one log at a time. It was a defiant act in a land that seemed to swallow whole anyone who dared to stand alone. She had come here with nothing but the clothes on her back and a searing memory of hands that were not gentle, voices that were not kind. She had been sold, passed like currency, her worth measured in acres and influence. But the last man, the one who thought he owned her soul along with her body, had underestimated the fire that smoldered beneath the ashes of her despair. She had run, not with a plan, just with the desperate need to breathe air that wasn't tainted by his presence. This small patch of unwanted land, miles from any real settlement, was all she could find, all she could hope to hold. From the rise overlooking the shallow creek, he watched Jedediah. His silhouette was as stark and weathered as the ancient, wind-twisted cottonwoods that dotted his own property line. He watched her labor, the sun glinting off the dark arc of her axe. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of necessary words to anyone in 5 years, not since the fever took Mary, and then little Clara. The silence in his own cabin was a living thing, heavy with their absence. He saw the girl, woman, he corrected himself, though she was young, too young for such harshness, and something in her solitary struggle resonated with the hollow chambers of his own grief. He was a widower, a man whose longing for a wife, for the warmth of family, was a constant, dull ache. He saw not a black girl, not an intruder, but a mirror of his own isolation, a tenacity that pricked at his dormant humanity. He recognized the set of her jaw, the way she pushed through exhaustion. He knew that look. It was the look of survival. The town, what little of it there was, a dusty main street, a saloon, a general store, and a stark white church whose bell pealed with judgmental regularity, already buzzed. He'd heard the whispers on his rare trips for supplies. A runaway. A woman of ill repute. Alone. The assumptions were swift, cruel, and coated in a veneer of piety. He ignored them, as he ignored most things that emanated from the huddle of humanity calling itself redemption. Redemption. He often wondered what it was they thought they were redeeming. Ilara felt his eyes sometimes, a prickling on her skin. She'd straighten, her hand instinctively going to the small, sharp knife she kept tucked in her waistband. Fear was an old acquaintance. She'd scan the ridge, see the distant, unmoving figure. A white man. Alone. The equation was simple, terrifying. But he never approached. He just watched. And then, one morning, after a particularly vicious early blizzard had swept through, leaving a thick blanket of white, she found a neatly stacked pile of dry, seasoned firewood near her half-built wall, far more than her meager foraging could have produced. There were no tracks leading to it but her own from the day before. The wind, she told herself. The wind played tricks. But the wood was undeniably real, and it burned with a steady, comforting heat that night, pushing back the gnawing cold that was her constant enemy. He didn't speak. She didn't look towards the ridge. But something had shifted, a silent acknowledgement passing on the indifferent wind. The rhythm of her days continued, marked by the thud of the axe, the scrape of the draw knife, the lifting and settling of logs. The cabin walls rose, a testament to sheer will. Ilara grew leaner, harder, her movements economical, her gaze steady. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had receded, replaced by a watchful caution. After the firewood, other things appeared. A rabbit, cleaned and dressed, left on a flat stone near her water source. A sack of flour, tucked into a dry crevice in the rocks she used as a makeshift larder. Once, a small, cast-iron pot, old but serviceable, sitting by her cold fire pit. She never saw him leave them. There were never fresh tracks, only the subtle signs of his passage, a displaced stone, a bent twig, things only someone who lived by the land would notice. Jedediah worked his own small ranch, mending fences, tending his few remaining cattle, the actions rote, mechanical. His gaze, however, often drifted towards the smoke that now rose, a thin, determined spiral, from Ilara's chimney. He'd found the small, almost finished cabin of his Mary, the one they were building for themselves before Clara came, and before the sickness. He couldn't bring himself to finish it, nor to tear it down. It stood as a monument to what was lost. Seeing Ilara build hers, log by painful log, stirred a forgotten instinct within him, to provide, to protect. Not with words. Words had failed him when Mary slipped away, when Clara's tiny hand went limp in his. Actions were all he had left. Actions were honest. Ilara began to leave things in return. A small bundle of dried herbs she'd gathered, good for tea. A roughly carved wooden bird, a skill remembered from a childhood long buried. She'd placed them on the same flat stone where his offerings appeared, a silent, reciprocal gesture. She still didn't look towards the ridge when she did so, but the tension in her shoulders eased a fraction. The townsfolk of Redemption grew bolder in their curiosity, their judgment. Preacher Eli Stone, a man whose righteousness was as unyielding as the prairie winters, made it his business to investigate. He rode out one afternoon, his Bible clutched in one hand, his gaze stern. Ilara saw him coming, a dark figure on a pale horse, and her heart clenched. She stood straighter, her hand near her knife, her face a mask of neutrality. "Woman," Preacher Stone began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "this is God-fearing country. We have ways here." He didn't dismount. Ilara said nothing. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any defiance. "There are concerns," he continued, gesturing vaguely towards the distant outline of Jedediah's ranch. "A lone woman. A reclusive man. It ain't proper." Ilara's eyes, dark and unreadable, met his. She still didn't speak. He huffed, his face reddening. The good people of Redemption expect decency. Order. He clearly expected her to be cowed, to offer explanations, perhaps even to weep. She did none of these things. From the ridge, Jedediah watched. He saw Stone's arrival, saw the stiffening of Ilara's spine. He didn't move, but his hand rested on the stock of the Winchester that was always close. If Stone had made a move, any move that threatened her, but Stone was a man of words, mostly. Poisonous words, but words nonetheless. After a few more pronouncements about moral laxity and the dangers of solitude, Preacher Stone, clearly dissatisfied with her stoic silence, wheeled his horse and rode back towards Redemption, his pronouncements on her soul likely already forming for next Sunday's sermon. Ilara watched him go, then slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That evening, by the flat stone, she found a worn but warm woolen blanket. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and old sorrow. She wrapped it around her shoulders as the night chill crept in, the scent a strange comfort. The land was harsh, the town judgmental, but here, in this small, emerging space between two silences, something was slowly being built, something more than just a cabin. The changing seasons etched themselves onto the land, and onto Ilara. The sun deepened the color of her skin, the wind and labor sculpted her frame. Her cabin was nearly complete, the roof thatched with prairie grass, a stone chimney breathing smoke. Inside, it was sparse but her own. A rough-hewn table, a single stool, the bed a pile of pine boughs covered with the blanket Jedediah had left. She had found a rhythm here, a fragile piece punctuated by the unspoken exchanges with the man on the ridge. One afternoon, a late autumn storm blew in with savage fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at her new roof, driving icy rain sideways. Ilara fought to secure the door, to patch a spot where the thatch threatened to give way. the small structure groaned under the assault. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She thought of the stories of cabins blown away, of people lost to the prairie's unbridled rage. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. A particularly violent gust ripped a section of thatch from the roof, and the rain poured in. Despair began to creep in. Then, through the roar of the wind, she heard it, a heavy thud against the outside wall. And another. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a dark shape, barely visible in the maelstrom, Jedediah, his back to the wind, wedging fallen timber and heavy stones against the windward side of her cabin, reinforcing it against the storm's fury. He worked tirelessly, a bulwark against the elements, never looking towards her door, never speaking. He was simply there, doing what needed to be done. When the worst of it had passed, and the wind began to abate, he was gone, vanished as silently as he had appeared. The next morning, under a bruised and sullen sky, Elara surveyed the damage. Minimal, thanks to his intervention. By the flat stone, there was a small pail of fresh milk, still warm, and a loaf of rough bread. She touched the pail, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. This was more than provision. This was care. That day, she took the wooden bird she had carved, a hawk, its wings spread in flight, and walked, not towards the flat stone, but directly towards the ridge, towards his property line. She didn't cross it, but she walked closer than she ever had before. She placed the hawk on a fence post, then turned and walked back to her cabin. She didn't look to see if he was watching, but she felt his gaze. Later, she saw the hawk was gone from the post. The town of Redemption, however, was not so easily appeased. Preacher Stone's sermons had taken root in fertile ground of suspicion and self-righteousness. Mrs. Abigail Henderson, the mayor's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's virtue, began to speak openly of that woman and the unseemly arrangement with the widower Jedediah. "It's a disgrace," she'd pronounce at the general store, her voice carrying. "A blight on our community. Something must be done." The whispers grew into murmurs, the murmurs into a low, simmering resentment. They saw Elara's growing cabin not as a symbol of resilience, but of defiance. They saw Jedediah's quiet support not as kindness, but as complicity in something vaguely sinful, something that threatened their narrow, ordered world. They didn't understand the language of silence, the currency of shared hardship. They understood only what fit their preconceived notions. A young man, Tom Ewell, whose father owned a large tract of land bordering the creek, began to take an unhealthy interest in Elara's small claim. He'd ride by, ostentatiously, sometimes with a friend or two, their laughter coarse, their gazes lingering. Elara ignored them, her face impassive, but her hand stayed close to her knife. Jedediah noticed. He started to make his presence on the ridge more visible when Ewell was near, often cleaning his Winchester, the sunlight glinting off the barrel. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ewell and his companions would soon find reasons to ride elsewhere. But the pressure from the town was building, a slow, inexorable tightening. The cabin was almost a home, the silence almost a comfort, but the world outside was closing in. The first snows of winter had begun to dust the plains, sharpening the air, laying a brittle silence over the land. Elara's cabin, now chinked tight with mud and grass, stood sturdy against the encroaching cold. Inside, a small fire crackled, its warmth a precious commodity. She was mending a tear in her glove, the silence of the small room broken only by the hiss of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside. Jedediah had continued his silent offerings, a side of venison, a few potatoes from his meager harvest, once even a small, worn book of poetry, its pages yellowed and soft. Elara, in turn, had left him a pair of carefully knitted mittens, using yarn unraveled from a discarded shawl she'd found. Their communication was a thread woven through the landscape, unseen by others, yet strong and resilient. But the town of Redemption was stirring. The whispers had found a voice, a leader. Not Preacher Stone, whose condemnations were more atmospheric than actionable, but Hiram Granger, a landowner whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. Granger had long coveted the stretch of land along the creek, the very land Elara had claimed and Jedediah's property bordered. Her presence, and Jedediah's silent guardianship of it, was an impediment. Granger began to rally the more discontented elements of the town. He spoke of squatters, of lawlessness, of the need to protect their community from undesirables. He played on their fears, their prejudices, painting Elara as a threat, a vagrant, and Jedediah as a man who had turned his back on his own kind. His words were poison, seeping into the cracks of their righteousness. One crisp morning, Elara stepped outside to fetch water from the creek and saw them. A group of men, perhaps a dozen, riding towards her cabin. Granger was at their head, his face set in a grim, determined expression. Beside him, looking uncomfortable but resolute, was Preacher Stone. Young Tom Ewell was there too, a smirk on his face. Fear, cold and immediate, gripped Elara. This was not a visit of curiosity. This was a threat. She backed slowly towards her door, her hand instinctively finding the hilt of her knife. She would not run. Not again. From his vantage point, Jedediah saw them too. He had been expecting something like this. The town's animosity had been a gathering storm. He took his Winchester from its pegs, checked the load. His face was a mask of grim resolve. He thought of Mary, of Clara, of the helplessness he had felt then. He would not feel that again. He started down the slope towards Elara's cabin, his movements deliberate, unhurried, but with a purpose that was unmistakable. He didn't run. He walked, a solitary figure moving to intercept a tide of malice. The men reined in a short distance from Elara's cabin. Granger dismounted, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "Woman," he called out, his voice harsh. "You're on land that ain't yours. You've been tolerated long enough." Elara stood in her doorway, small but unbent. Her eyes, usually downcast or watchful, were fixed on Granger. She didn't speak. "This here is an affront to decent folk," Preacher Stone intoned, though his gaze kept darting nervously towards the figure now descending the ridge. "The community has decided. You will leave by sundown," Granger added, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "Or we'll remove you." Tom Ewell snickered. "And your little shack with you." Elara's gaze didn't waver. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. She felt the cold, but deep inside, a different kind of fire was stirring, a slow burn of defiance that had been kindled log by painstaking log. She had built this place with her own hands, her own sweat, her own blood. It was hers. Jedediah reached the edge of Elara's small clearing just as Granger uttered his ultimatum. He didn't announce his presence with words. His arrival was statement enough, the Winchester held loosely but ready in his hands. The townsmen shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering slightly at the sight of the reclusive widower, a man known for his silence but also for an unyielding toughness forged in hardship. Granger scowled. "Stay out of this, Jedediah." "This ain't your concern." Jedediah's eyes, pale blue and cold as the winter sky, settled on Granger. He didn't speak. His silence was more potent than any threat. He simply stood, a step or two to the side and slightly behind Elara, a silent, unwavering ally. All eyes turned back to Elara. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. She looked at the faces before her, Granger's greed, Stone's misguided zeal, Ewell's cruel amusement, the other's fear and uncertainty. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the degradation, the endless running. She thought of the axe, the logs, the feel of the earth beneath her feet. She thought of the silent kindnesses, the firewood, the blanket, the shared solitude that had become a strange kind of sanctuary. And then, she found her voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, resonant, carrying in the still, cold air. No, a single word. But it was a word weighted with all the logs she had lifted, all the nights she had endured, all the dignity she had painstakingly reclaimed. Granger's eyes narrowed. "What did you say, girl?" "I said no," Elara repeated, her chin lifting a fraction. Her voice, though quiet, held no trace of fear, only a profound, unshakable certainty. "This is my home. I built it. I claim it." Preacher Stone sputtered. "Woman, you have no right." "I have the right of my labor," Elara cut him off, her gaze sweeping over them. "The right of my sweat. The right of my survival. This land was nothing. I made it something. It is mine. She took a step forward, out of the shadow of her doorway, into the pale winter sun. Her posture, once hunched with fear and shame, was now erect, her shoulders back. The transformation was subtle, yet profound. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a claimant, a woman standing her ground. Tom Ewell, emboldened by numbers, sneered. Just a runaway slave girl playing homesteader. We'll see about your rights. He made a move to step forward, but Jedediah shifted, the movement almost imperceptible, yet it froze Ewell in his tracks. The barrel of the Winchester hadn't moved, but the intent was clear. This woman, Jedediah's voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together, but it cut through the tension, is under my protection. This land, he gestured slightly with the rifle barrel, encompassing Elara's cabin and the creek, is under my watch. You will leave her be. Granger's face flushed with anger. You can't protect her from all of us, Jedediah. You're one man, I am. Jedediah agreed, his gaze unwavering. And I am here. The simple declaration hung in the air. The townsmen looked at each other, their resolve wavering. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone, frightened woman. They had not bargained for Jedediah, nor for the quiet strength Elara had found. The confrontation held for another long moment, a silent battle of wills. Then, one by one, some of the men at the back began to shift, to look away. The certainty of their cause was eroding under the combined weight of Elara's defiance and Jedediah's implacable presence. Preacher Stone, seeing his moral crusade crumbling, wrung his hands. This is ungodly, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Granger, seeing his support dissolving, spat on the ground. This ain't over, he snarled, but the threat felt hollow. He glared at Elara, then at Jedediah. With a curt, angry gesture, he remounted his horse. The others followed suit, their departure far less unified, far less confident than their arrival. They rode away, a straggling, defeated procession, leaving Elara and Jedediah standing in the quiet clearing. The wind sighed through the pines. Elara slowly let out a breath. She turned to Jedediah, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, only a deep, unspoken understanding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice still holding the echo of her newfound strength. Jedediah gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words. He looked at her cabin, then at her. A flicker of something akin to peace, perhaps even a nascent warmth, touched his stern features. The silence that settled between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of shared victory, of a bond forged in adversity and defiance. Inside her cabin, the fire still burned. Elara added another log. Later that day, Jedediah returned, not with provisions, but with his tools. He didn't ask. He simply began to inspect her roof, finding the places the storm had weakened, the places the townsfolk might have targeted. Elara brought out the rough stool, and then, after a moment's hesitation, a second, smaller block of wood she sometimes used as a seat. She set them near the fire. She filled the cast iron pot with water for tea, using the herbs she had gathered. When Jedediah came inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he saw the two seats, the pot beginning to steam. He looked at Elara. She met his gaze, a small, almost shy smile touching her lips. He sat on the stool. She sat on the block of wood. The silence was comfortable, filled with the crackle of the fire and the promise of a shared warmth. The town of redemption still whispered, but their words had lost their power. Elara was no longer just the black girl building her cabin. Jedediah was no longer just the lone widower. They were a testament to something the town could not understand, that family could be found, that strength could be built, one log, one act of kindness, one defiant word at a time. The winter deepened, but inside the small cabin, there was a growing light. The vast, indifferent plains did not seem so empty anymore. They had found their peace, a defiant, hard-won peace, together. We hope you were moved by Elara and Jedediah's story of resilience and found family. If their journey resonated with you, please let us know in the comments below. What did you think of Ilara finding her voice? What was your favorite moment of unspoken connection between them? Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational short films and dramatic storytelling. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next release. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for watching.